Adrienne Whaley, Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and Bert Dunkerly, an historian, an award-winning author, currently a park ranger at the Richmond National Battlefield Park, talk about understanding the entirety of the American Revolution.
So one of the things that we were called together to discuss was the roles and the experiences of women in the Revolutionary War and in the American Revolution writ large. And you mentioned that you did research on a book about this topic. I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. I was in South Carolina for several years working at Kings Mountain Revolutionary War Battlefield. And there was a story about women, two women who were in the battle with the British. One of them was killed and buried on the site. And I was just interested in that, and I wanted to research it and learn more about it. What I found was that the things that had been written about them were done a long time ago, and were kind of biased, I guess. They were written in the 1800s with that kind of typical Victorian mindset of what women should be and should do at that time. And I also discovered stories about other women in other engagements in South Carolina, North Carolina, and same thing. There was nothing really recent done about who they were and what they really did, and that just motivated me to dig into that topic. And it was just really fascinating because what I found was that I couldn't maybe identify everybody and build a real biography of everybody, but it was the way that they were remembered was as a filter. They're being written about in the 1800s, and it's 100 years after the events, and the people who are writing about them in the 1800s are applying their values. And I wanted to get through that to understand the real people, if I could. They were involved as camp followers who were attached to the armies, and they have important roles in the armies. That's one of the myths, is that people think camp followers are prostitutes or women of low character and that kind of thing. And they played a very important role in the armies. And I feel that the armies couldn't function without them. They were not cooking for the most part, but they were serving as nurses. They did odd jobs in camp. They did a lot of the behind the scenes logistical things. That's what the military today would call it, logistics, that the armies didn't have people to do those things. So the camp followers did them. They were paid and got rations, just like a soldier. They were subject to army discipline, just like a soldier. They're part of the army. They're on the muster rolls. So that's an important point that's not really well understood and is fascinating. And for those civilians who are caught up in the struggle, impacting them, the war comes to their farms and their homes.
People come to the story of the American Revolution sometimes, or oftentimes actually, because they're really interested in the battles. And there's nothing wrong with that. Battles are really interesting. They're dramatic. There are these crazy points of decision making that take place. There are just staggering numbers and interesting tools, and you get to think about science and technology and all of these different things. And so it's totally understandable that people can come to the story of the American Revolution through that perspective. But you think about all of the people who were living in British North America on the eve of the Revolution, and all of the people who were living through the Revolutionary era, and they're not all soldiers. Right. And so what is happening in places outside of the encampments, and what's happening off of the battlefields, what's happening in the cities and the towns and the rural communities, what's happening on farms and in shops and with artisans, what's happening on ships and all sorts of things like that. It's difficult to understand the entirety of the revolution if you're not looking at all of the different stories. That's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the work that the Liberty Trail is doing. Like it's understanding that yes, a lot of what's taking place in the revolution is what's happening on the battlefield, but even those battlefield stories are very large. So the work that the American Battlefield Trust and that the South Carolina Battlefield Trust are doing to use those as focal points to expand the story, I think is really interesting. But Bert, you've been sort of affiliated with this process, and you kind of know a bit more about what's happening with the Liberty Trail. Do you want to say a word about what that is?
It's an absolutely wonderful program, and they're preserving battlefields, uh, campsites, fortifications, other important sites that are associated with the revolution. And some of these have been around and are well known, but some of them are not. And they're also preserving and bringing forward sites that have stories associated with them that people have heard of, but maybe don't know the real truth of it, or know the real details. Like Rebecca Mott, who was a woman who allowed and encouraged the Americans to burn down her house because the British were inside of it. And the house was ultimately not totally destroyed. But that's a story that's out there. It's popular. People tell it. They know about it.
Imagine being her and making that decision. Imagine the people who were inside of her house. Imagine the people who lit that fire. It's unthinkable in a way to be able to go, wow, like that's admirable. And yet sometimes our first reaction is just like a what a crazy decision this woman had to make. She must have been like a super badass. It reminds me earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the fact that for so many of the women that you were researching for that book on women in the American Revolution, that they lived into the 1830s and 40s and 50s, but that there were no photographs for so many of them. One of the things that people are surprised to discover when they come to our museum, and again, spoiler alert, when you get to the end of our galleries, you actually encounter a wall of photographs of people that we call the revolutionary generation, folks who were alive during the American Revolution, but who lived into the age of photography and were photographed. They have no idea that people of that time could be photographed, and something about the immediacy of that kind of an image versus a watercolor versus an oil painting or other representations that we see of the revolutionary era, oftentimes that is what brings home to them that the people that they were talking about were just as real, just as flesh and blood as they are in the world today.
I love those photographs, especially Sarah Osborne. Love her photo. Yeah, that's really powerful. And just finding that way to make people connect and see that these were real people is such a powerful tool.
All right. Well, Bert, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed getting to learn a little bit more about who you are, what you've been researching, and your experiences when it comes to Revolutionary Era history.
Well, thanks. It was great to meet you, and keep up the good work at the museum. I will look forward to visiting at some point in the future.